The levee had already failed once. 2 years before September 1928, a hurricane moved across the Gulf of Mexico and pushed a surge of water into the southwestern shore of Lake Okeechobee. The earthen wall holding the lake back was 4 feet high. It was built from muck and sand, compacted local soil, raised by local developers in the 1910s to hold back a lake the size of a small sea. In September 1926, that wall broke. Water poured through the community of Moore Haven on the lake's southwest shore. Between 200 and 300 people drowned. Then the water receded, the bodies were counted, and the wall was not replaced. It was not raised. It was not reinforced by the state or the federal government. By the summer of 1928, the embankment around Lake Okeechobee was still 4 feet of compacted earth. Behind it lived and worked several thousand people. Most of them were black migrant laborers from the Bahamas and the American South. They had come to work the drained farmland south of the lake, fertile, dark soil called muck, created when Florida drained thousands of acres of the northern Everglades for agriculture. They were the people the system had brought to work the land. They were not the people the system had built the wall to protect. On the night of September 16, 1928, the same levee failed again. To understand who died at Lake Okeechobee, you have to understand what they were doing there and what had been done to the land before they arrived. In the first decades of the 20th century, Florida undertook one of the largest drainage projects in American history. The goal was the northern Everglades. Underneath the shallow wetlands lay black, organic soil, muck, that was among the most productive agricultural earth in North America. Drain it and you could grow vegetables through the winter. Plant beans, sugarcane, celery. Sell them north when northern fields were frozen. Florida sold this as a promise, and to work the reality of it, the promise needed labor. The communities of Everglades, Pahokee, Chosin, South Bay, and Bean City grew up in the muck south and southeast of Lake Okeechobee. They were new towns, built quickly, organized around seasonal planting cycles. By the mid-1920s, they were populated largely by black migrant workers, many originally from the Bahamas, many from the American South, following harvests from state to state. They lived in labor camps, in small wooden structures, in buildings that offered limited defense against a severe storm. Many of these workers had no formal lease on the land they worked. Many had no registered address in Palm Beach County. No payroll ledger documented their exact presence in the region. This is not incidental background. It is the reason the death count was wrong for 75 years. Before the hurricane, the numbers were clear to at least 2 men who were paid to know them. Florida's chief drainage engineer, Fred C. Elliott, had been warning since at least 1920 that the earthen embankment around Lake Okeechobee was not adequate protection for the communities behind it. The lake was one of the largest freshwater bodies in the United States. In a major hurricane, wind pushing from the north could pile an enormous volume of water against the southern shore. A 4-foot earthen wall, the kind local developers had built from muck and sand in the 1910s, could not contain that surge. Elliott knew this. His warnings are part of the state record. In 1924, Congressman Herbert J. Drain began making requests to Congress for federal authorization and funding for flood control around Lake Okeechobee. The state of Florida lacked the funds to build what was needed independently. Federal involvement was the only path to a proper levee. Congress declined. Then it declined again. The requests continued through 1928. None of them succeeded before September of that year. And then it was standing in the record, in Elliott's assessments, in Drain's congressional requests, in the waterline that Moore Haven had carried since 1926. It was ignored not out of ignorance. It was ignored because the people behind the wall were not the people the system had been arranged to protect. The storm formed near the Cape Verde Islands in early September 1928. It crossed the Atlantic, striking Guadeloupe first, with no advance warning to the island. More than 1,000 people died there. By September 13th, the hurricane reached Puerto Rico, where it was called San Felipe II, St. Philip II, because it arrived on the feast day of that saint. Wind speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour. Puerto Rico suffered more than 300 deaths and widespread destruction. Then the storm curved northward. Meteorologists initially predicted the hurricane would move west into the Yucatan Channel, away from Florida. By September 14th and 15th, the track shifted. The storm was moving northwest, directly toward the Florida coast. Early on September 16th, the Weather Bureau issued hurricane warnings from Miami north to Daytona Beach. The forecast predicted landfall near Jupiter, with dangerous storm surge and winds capable of destroying structures. For coastal residents with resources, cars, access to roads, places to go, this warning was actionable. Many on the coast left. For the communities around Lake Okeechobee, the warning arrived in a different context. In 1928, many residents had no radio. Newspapers traveled on roads that were often unpaved. Some households learned about the approaching storm through word of mouth, if they learned at all. Evacuation east meant moving toward the coast, directly into the storm's path. Roads south and west were minimal. For the workers in the muck camps south of the lake, there was no viable direction to move. The hurricane warning was information without an available response. Some people sought shelter in Everglades' two-story buildings, believing the elevated floors would be enough. Some left, then returned when the eye of the hurricane passed over and the wind briefly stopped. They believed the worst was over. They were in the eye, the rear eye wall was still coming. And south of the lake, the same 4-foot wall that had broken at Moore Haven in 1926 stood unchanged. The hurricane made landfall on the evening of September 16, near Palm Beach on Florida's Atlantic coast. It was a Category 4 storm. Wind speeds at landfall were measured at approximately 145 miles per hour. The coastal storm surge near Jupiter reached 10 feet. Piers were destroyed. Buildings collapsed. The Atlantic coast of Palm Beach County was devastated. Then the storm moved inland. As the hurricane tracked northwest, it crossed the 30-mile width of Lake Okeechobee. The wind from the north side of the eye pushed water southward across the lake's full length. This is what storm surge on an inland lake looks like. Not a wave from the ocean, but the entire body of the lake tilted by sustained wind, piling water against its southern shore for hours. The level at the south end of the lake rose. The 4-foot earthen levee held for a while, then it didn't. Water overtopped the southern embankment sometime after midnight, then sections of the levee collapsed entirely. Water moved across the lowlands south of the lake in a surge that reached an estimated 15 to 20 feet deep in some areas near the breach. 450 square miles were underwater. Everglades, Pahokee, Chosin, South Bay, Bean City. In some communities, the water rose faster than any structure could carry people to safety. The wooden houses and labor camp buildings offered almost nothing. Some 2-story buildings survived. Most single-story structures did not. As the rear eye wall passed, the wind reversed. The water that had pushed south now pushed back north. The northern levee, stressed by the reversal, also failed. Communities on the lake's north shore were flooded in the second passage. By morning on September 17th, the region south and north of Lake Okeechobee was submerged. Roads had dissolved. The canal and drainage systems that had made the muck farmable were overwhelmed. Floodwaters would persist in some areas for weeks. The hurricane moved north through the state, then out to sea, then made a second landfall on the South Carolina coast. By September 21st, it had dissipated over Ontario. It left behind a flooded plain where no official count had been prepared, because no official count had ever been needed before. The American Red Cross arrived in the days following the storm. Their task was to count the dead, but counting required a baseline, a census of who had been in the affected area before the storm. In the migrant labor camps south of Lake Okeechobee, that baseline did not exist. Workers had arrived seasonally. Many were Bahamian nationals on informal labor arrangements with no formal documentation in Florida. Many were Black American workers with no registered address in Palm Beach County. The agricultural economy of the muck had been built precisely on this informality, cheap, flexible labor that arrived for harvest and left without paperwork. The Red Cross issued its estimate, 1,836 dead. This number became the official record. It was carried in newspapers, in government reports, in the standard figure for the storm for decades. The 1928 Okeechobee hurricane would be listed as the second deadliest hurricane in the contiguous United States at 1,836. But 1,836 was not what the burial site said. In a 1958 letter, Lawrence E. Will, a Everglades resident who had lived through the disaster and spent years documenting it, estimated the actual death toll at approximately 2,500. Will had worked in the region through and after the disaster. He had watched the bodies collected. He understood what the Red Cross had not counted. In 2003, the National Weather Service formally revised its official death toll to at least 2,500. The basis for the revision included multiple lines of evidence. Burial site records, when aggregated across Woodlawn Cemetery, Port Mayaca, and the Tamarind Avenue site, contained a documented total of 2,143 bodies. Scholarly analysis had noted that the Red Cross estimate had not accounted for the undocumented migrant population. The gap between 1,836 and 2,500 is not a rounding error. It is the shape of the labor system traced into a casualty list. Workers who were not registered could not be missed. Workers who were not on any county record could not be reported absent. The system that had brought them to the muck south of Lake Okeechobee had never needed to track them while they were alive. It did not suddenly begin tracking them when they were dead. Florida's public health authorities issued a directive for the rapid disposal of bodies. In late September heat, with floodwaters standing across hundreds of square miles, disease was a genuine risk. The directive was a practical response to a genuine emergency. It was also the framework within which racial segregation determined whose death would be recorded and whose would not. In West Palm Beach, white victims were transported to Woodlawn Cemetery. 61 of the 69 bodies interred there were identified as white. Family members were permitted to attempt identification. The deaths were registered in county records. 674 black victims were brought to a site at Tamarind Avenue and 25th Street in West Palm Beach. They were interred in a mass grave. No individual markers were placed. The deaths were not individually registered. At Port Mayaca Cemetery in Martin County, approximately 1,600 bodies were placed in a mass burial. Reports from the period indicate that some bodies were burned in funeral pyres. Accounts from the time document that black survivors were pressed into service collecting and transporting bodies without compensation. The tent cities erected for survivors were segregated. One for white residents, one for black residents. The mass grave at Tamarind Avenue and 25th Street contained 684 people. It was not marked. For more than 60 years, no historical marker identified what lay beneath it. At some point, a road was rerouted across part of the site. The physical location of the interments was, over time, lost to ordinary use. In 1937, Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God. Hurston had lived in Everglades. She had collected accounts from labor camp workers and from the manager of one of the local labor camps, who had been present through the disaster and its aftermath. The novel's final section depicts the hurricane and the burial practices that followed with a specificity that the official record had declined to preserve. The historical marker at the Tamarind Avenue site was installed in 2003, 75 years after the storm. The disaster did not arrive without precedent. Every condition for it was built, named, reported, and left in place. In the weeks following the hurricane, Herbert Hoover, who had just won the presidential election but had not yet taken office, traveled to the Lake Okeechobee region to inspect the damage. After taking office the following March, he backed federal flood control involvement. The Florida State Legislature created the Okeechobee Flood Control District. The River and Harbor Act of 1930 authorized the construction of a proper levee system. The Army Corps of Engineers built it between 1932 and 1938. It encircles the lake for more than 140 miles. It stands today as the Herbert Hoover Dike. It is an actual engineered structure, not a muck embankment. It was built after 2,500 dead, not after Fred Elliott's 1920 assessment that the existing wall was inadequate. Not after Congressman Drain's 1924 request for federal funds. Not after Moore Haven in 1926, when the same wall had already failed and already killed. It was built only after the disaster became too large to treat as a local problem. Florida drained the Everglades to create agricultural land. It recruited workers from the Bahamas and the American South because the labor was needed and the wages could stay low. It placed those workers behind a levee it knew was not sufficient. It watched that levee fail in 1926, killing hundreds, and did not rebuild it. It allowed the same failure to repeat in 1928 on a larger scale, across a larger population, with a larger and less documented workforce. Then it counted 1,936. The gap between 1,936 and 2,500 is a structural record. The deaths that could not be counted were the deaths of people the system was not designed to count. The levee that was not repaired was the levee protecting people the system was not designed to protect. The hurricane did not begin on the night of September 16, 1928. It began in 1915 when a 4-foot muck wall was built and considered sufficient. It continued in 1920 when an engineer named it insufficient and no one acted. It continued in 1926 when the wall failed and the dead were buried and the wall stayed standing. It arrived in 1928 to find the same wall, the same absence, the same people the system had brought to work the land and had never arranged to keep alive. The official number is now at least 2,500. It has been at least 2,500 since the 2003 revision. And the reason it was 1,836 for 75 years is the same reason the levee was 4 feet tall. The people behind the wall were not supposed to require counting. That is not this hurricane's surprise. That is this system's record.